All right, get ready to climb, scramble, and navigate, because today we're diving deep into the world of mountain sports.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a whole stack of articles and research here, all about pushing limits in some really breathtaking landscapes.
Absolutely.
We're talking intense mountain marathons, multi-day epics of adventure racing, and even high mountain tours.
Yeah, it's a world that has really seen a surge in popularity lately,
Oh, yeah.
especially adventure racing. You wouldn't believe this, but participation in the U.S. more than quadrupled between 2006 and 2016.
Wow.
It's outpacing growth in even those traditional activities like running and skiing.
That is wild. I wonder if it's that need to disconnect and challenge yourself, especially with how tech-driven our lives have become. But
I think so.
before we get ahead of ourselves, let's define what we're actually talking about here.
Yeah, good idea.
We've got these mountain marathons, adventure racing, and high mountain tours, all with that shared love for the mountains,
Right.
but each with its own unique twist.
Exactly. Take mountain marathons, for instance. They're this real blend of endurance running and survival skills and some serious navigational chops.
Oh, wow.
You're talking 2-day events where you're not just covering some really tough terrain, but you're also carrying all your own gear.
Wow.
And often relying on map and compass skills to find your way.
So that's a far cry from your casual weekend trail run.
Oh, absolutely.
This sounds almost like a mini expedition.
Yeah.
And speaking of legendary events, we can't forget the original mountain marathon, the OMM.
Yes.
It's been running strong since 1968 and is known for its intense courses.
Yeah, and here's where things get really interesting.
Right.
The OMM course isn't revealed until the race starts.
What?
So it forces participants to think on their feet and adapt to those challenges as they unfold.
Wow.
Imagine the pressure of not knowing what's around the next bend, having to constantly reevaluate your route and your energy reserves.
That's insane. I can barely plan a grocery list without second-guessing myself. It makes you wonder how people even train for that level of uncertainty.
Well, they do it by honing those navigation skills and embracing the unexpected. You've also got other events like the Saunders Lakeland Mountain Marathon, or SLMM,
Okay.
which is known for being slightly less intense.
Slightly.
Rumor has it there's even a pub near the overnight camp.
Oh, now that's a reward I could get behind.
Right.
Maybe a little less intense for me, but speaking of pushing limits, let's dive into what's often called the last wild race, adventure racing.
Oh, yes.
I get that it's multidisciplinary, but what does that actually look like in practice?
Okay, so picture this.
Okay.
Teams of 2 to 5 people navigating these unmarked wilderness courses.
Wow.
It's not just about covering distance. It's about mastering a mix of disciplines, trekking, mountain biking, paddling, sometimes even climbing abseiling or horse riding.
Wow.
And these races can last anywhere from a few hours to weeks, with the clock running nonstop.
Wait, weeks? Nonstop? That's more than a race. That's an expedition. Do people even sleep?
Sleep, eat, rest, it all becomes a strategic game. Teams have to constantly balance pushing their limits with managing their resources and making smart decisions about when and where to rest.
Oh, wow.
That's what makes it so fascinating, this constant dance between physical endurance and strategic thinking.
And the history of this sport is as wild as the races themselves, right?
Pretty much.
I know there's some debate about the origins,
Yeah.
but it seems like things really took off in the 80s.
You're right. Some point to that 1968 OMM as a precursor. But events like the Alpine Ironman in New Zealand and the Alaska Mountain Wilderness Classic in the early 80s really helped shape the modern format.
Mm-hmm.
Then came the legendary Raid Gaulois in 1989, this massive multi-day expedition race that solidified adventure racing as a global phenomenon.
Wow. So with that came the need for some kind of structure and safety regulations, right?
Yeah.
That's where organizations like the USR come in, working to establish standards and promote the sport responsibly.
Yeah, exactly. The formation of the USR in 1998 was a pivotal moment. Then, in 2001, the first official Adventure Racing World Series, or ARWS, was held, bringing the sport to a whole new level of recognition. And let's not forget the Patagonian Expedition Race, often dubbed the Last Wild Race, for its incredibly challenging routes through some of the most remote and rugged terrain on Earth.
It's amazing how this once niche activity has exploded in popularity. Do you think it's a response to our increasingly urbanized lives, a yearning for something raw and primal?
It's certainly a compelling question. Maybe it's that, or maybe it's the allure of pushing your own boundaries, testing yourself against the elements, and discovering a strength you never knew you had.
Now let's shift gears to high mountain tours, a world that demands a very specific set of skills and a comfort level with heights that I, for one, definitely don't possess.
Right. It's a different kind of challenge altogether, requiring expertise in navigating terrain above 3,000 meters, the zone where ice cover is permanent. We're talking glaciers, crevasses, the need for ropes, crampons, ice axes, a whole different skill set than your average height.
It's easy to think that hiking simply ends where climbing begins, but there's actually a scale that rates high mountain tours. The SEC Mountain and High Mountain Tour scale. Can you break that down for us?
Absolutely. What's fascinating is that a T5 or T6 hike on this scale, while technically considered hiking, can be far more demanding than, say, an easy-rated climb.
Really?
That's because you're often navigating extremely challenging terrains, sometimes exposed, and with significant consequences for a misstep, but without the protective gear you'd typically have in a climbing scenario.
So it's not just about the technical difficulty, but also about the level of risk assessment and self-reliance needed in a constantly changing high-altitude environment.
Precisely. And then there's the challenge of acclimatization.
Right.
Especially for high-altitude climbs in places like the Himalayas or the Andes, where the thin air adds another layer of complexity.
And speaking of mountains to climb, we have to talk about peak bagging. It sounds a bit like collecting stamps, but for mountains, what's the draw there?
You could say that peak bagging involves climbing various lists of mountains, like the 7 summits, the highest peaks on each continent, or the 8,000ers, those 14 giants over 8,000 meters high.
Wow.
There are even lists for specific regions, like the Munros, Corbetts, and Wainwrights in the UK.
So you've got these individuals setting out to conquer these lists versus the large-scale events we've been discussing.
Right.
I imagine there are different environmental considerations at play there.
You're absolutely right. While individual peak bagging definitely has an impact, particularly on popular routes, concentrated foot traffic and logistical demands of large events like adventure races or the National Three Peaks Challenge tend to raise bigger concerns.
Which brings us to the very important question of safety and regulation in these sports we're talking about, inherently risky activities, and we can't ignore the potential for accidents. I remember reading about the 2008 OMM, which had to be canceled due to extreme weather.
Yes, that caused quite a media frenzy at the time,
Yeah.
with headlines about 1,700 people being unaccounted for. But what often gets overlooked is that many of those competitors were experienced mountain rescuers themselves.
That's a good point. It speaks to the level of expertise and self-sufficiency in these communities.
Right.
But still, the potential for danger is always there. That's why organizations like the USR are so important, working to implement standardized safety protocols, insurance for participants, and consistent event rules to mitigate those risks.
Exactly. Many race organizers now have detailed rules in place, not just for the safety of the competitors and spectators, but also to address the potential environmental impact.
Can you give us an example of what those rules might look like?
Sure. Take the Marmot Dark Mountains event, for example.
Okay.
Their rules specifically state that participants must stick to designated paths, avoid littering, and respect uncrossable boundaries, even if they are physically crossable.
Interesting.
It's all about minimizing damage and promoting responsible recreation.
It seems like there's a growing awareness that you can't have the thrill without the responsibility, that these landscapes are more than just playgrounds for our enjoyment.
For sure.
They're delicate ecosystems that deserve our respect and protection.
Absolutely. And that leads us into a complex and often contentious debate about the environmental impact of these sports, which we'll explore in more detail after a short.
Well, before we jump ahead,
Yeah.
let's unpack those environmental concerns right now.
Oh, right.
What are the researchers finding, and how are these communities grappling with those impacts?
Yeah.
It seems like we're at a crucial point in this conversation. We've got this surge in popularity of mountain sports.
Right.
But at the same time, there's this growing awareness of the impact we're having on those very landscapes.
Yeah.
What are the researchers finding, and how are these communities grappling with those impacts?
You're right. It's a critical conversation, and thankfully there's a lot of research going into understanding the effects of outdoor recreation.
Okay.
We've got studies on everything from walking and running to mountain biking, horse riding, camping, even water activities. All those elements that often come into play in these mountain sports.
But isn't it a bit ironic that we need research to tell us that these activities have an impact? It seems pretty intuitive that trampling through sensitive ecosystems, especially in large groups, would leave a mark.
You're not wrong, but the research goes beyond the obvious. It's about quantifying those impacts, understanding the specific mechanisms at play, and ultimately identifying potential mitigation strategies.
So what are some of the key findings emerging from this research? What are those specific mechanisms you mentioned?
Well, for starters, the type of activity matters. Horse riding, for example, tends to have a higher impact per user than mountain biking or hiking, simply due to the weight and hoof action.
Makes sense.
Activities like camping, which involve longer stays in one location, can lead to more localized impacts like soil compaction and vegetation loss. And then there's the issue of scale. A few individuals exploring a remote area might have minimal impact, but large events like adventure races or the National Three Peaks Challenge bring a whole different level of pressure.
The Three Peaks Challenge is a great example. You've got thousands of people attempting to climb the highest peaks in Scotland, England, and Wales.
Right.
Often within a 24-hour period. It's a massive logistical undertaking.
Right.
And I imagine the environmental toll is significant.
It certainly is. We're talking about potential issues ranging from trail erosion and litter to traffic congestion and strain on local resources. The sheer number of people concentrated in those areas, often with support vehicles and all the associated infrastructure, raises a whole host of concerns.
It almost feels like a case of loving something to death. So how do we navigate this tension? How do we balance the undeniable personal benefits, the challenge, the camaraderie, the fundraising that often goes along with these events,
Right.
with the responsibility to protect those very environments?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's no easy answer, but one approach being discussed is limiting participant numbers.
Okay.
There's even talk of a registration system for the Three Peaks Challenge, requiring organizers to submit applications and adhere to stricter environmental guidelines.
That seems reasonable, but I imagine there would be pushback from those who see any restriction on access to these natural spaces as an infringement on their freedom.
Absolutely. It's a valid concern, and it speaks to that larger philosophical debate about individual liberty versus collective responsibility.
Yeah.
How do we balance the rights of individuals to enjoy these spaces with the need to protect them for future generations? It's a complex issue, and there are strong feelings on both sides.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
But there has to be some middle ground, right?
Yes.
Some way to allow people to experience these challenges without completely trashing the environment in the process.
Yeah.
What are some other potential solutions being explored?
Well, one idea is to encourage more off-peak events instead of everyone converging on the Three Peaks Challenge during a single weekend in the summer. Why not spread it out throughout the year? That would help reduce the concentrated impact on those specific areas.
That makes a lot of sense. And what about encouraging participants to be more mindful of their impact? Maybe provide education on leave no trace principles, or even have them participate in trail cleanup efforts as part of the challenge.
Those are excellent suggestions.
Right.
It's about shifting the mindset from one of just conquering a challenge to one of stewardship, of recognizing that we have a responsibility to leave these places better than we found them. We can't rely solely on rules and regulations. We need to cultivate a deeper ethic of care for the natural world among those who choose to recreate in it.
Absolutely. And maybe that starts with recognizing that even seemingly low-impact activities, when done on a large enough scale, can have significant cumulative effects.
Right.
It's not just about those extreme mountain sports. It's about how we approach outdoor recreation in general.
You've hit the nail on the head. This conversation extends far beyond adventure racing or mountain marathons.
Yeah.
It's about our fundamental relationship with nature as a whole.
Now there's a thought-provoking concept, our relationship with nature. It makes you wonder if these sports are attracting people who are yearning for a connection with the outdoors.
Right.
Are they also fostering a deeper sense of responsibility for those environments?
It's a fascinating question, and that's where initiatives like the Voluntary Code of Practice for the National Three Peaks Challenge come in.
Can you tell us more about that? What kind of guidelines does it promote?
It encourages organizers to limit group sizes, discourage racing between teams, to reduce the pressure on ecosystems, and educate participants about environmental sensitivities. It even suggests avoiding peak holiday times to distribute the impact more evenly.
So it's not just about saying no to these events, but finding ways to manage them more sustainably. Are there other examples of events taking a proactive approach to minimizing their footprint?
Absolutely. The Yorkshire Three Peaks Challenge, another popular event in the UK, is a great example. They've been actively promoting midweek events to spread the impact throughout the week. They also emphasize the importance of staying on designated paths to minimize erosion, reducing noise pollution, and even encourage participants to become friends of the Three Peaks to support local conservation efforts.
Those are great initiatives, it sounds like. They're really trying to strike that balance between allowing people to experience those challenges and preserving the integrity of those landscapes.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that these places are not just playgrounds for our enjoyment, but vital ecosystems that deserve our respect and protection. And that responsibility falls on all of us, whether we're seasoned mountaineers or casual hikers. Even small actions like choosing reusable water bottles and packing out our trash can make a difference.
It's a collective effort for sure. And maybe that's a good segue into our next topic, the unique challenges and risks associated with high mountain tours.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that Neville zone you mentioned earlier, that realm of permanent ice and snow. What are the specific considerations for venturing into that terrain? All right, so we're heading into that Neville zone, that realm of permanent ice and snow. What makes this terrain so different from, say, a regular mountain hike, even a challenging one?
It's a whole different ballgame up there. The Nival zone typically starts above 3,000 meters,
Right.
where those temperatures are consistently cold enough that snow and ice don't fully melt even in the warmer months.
Right.
And this creates this landscape that's constantly changing, with glaciers, flowing crevasses opening and closing, and the risk of rockfall or avalanches always present.
It sounds incredibly dynamic and, frankly, a bit intimidating.
It can be.
What kind of skills do you need to navigate that kind of environment safely?
Well, for starters, you need a solid foundation in mountaineering techniques. Think using crampons and ice axes for travel on snow and ice, understanding how to rope up for glacier travel to mitigate that risk of falling into a crevasse, and knowing how to assess snow conditions for avalanche hazards.
So it's not just about being physically fit and having a good sense of direction like in those mountain marathons.
Right.
This requires a whole other level of technical expertise.
Exactly. And on top of those technical skills, there's the added challenge of acclimatization.
Oh, right.
As you ascend to higher altitudes, the air gets thinner with less available oxygen.
Right.
This can lead to altitude sickness, which can range from mild symptoms like headaches and fatigue to more serious conditions like high-altitude pulmonary edema or HAPE or high-altitude cerebral edema or HACE.
So even if you're a seasoned athlete, the high mountains can still throw some serious curveballs your way.
Oh, absolutely. That's why it's crucial to ascend, gradually giving your body time to adjust to those decreasing oxygen levels. Many climbers will spend days or even weeks acclimatizing before attempting a high-altitude peak.
It makes you realize that those towering peaks are not to be taken lightly. It's a humbling experience, to say the least.
It is.
And it makes me wonder, with all these inherent risks and challenges, what is it that draws people to high mountain tours in the first place?
That's a great question. I think it's different for everyone, but there's a certain allure to the raw beauty and power of these landscapes. It's a chance to test your physical and mental limits, to step outside your comfort zone, and to experience a sense of awe and wonder that's hard to find anywhere else.
It's that primal connection with nature, the feeling of being completely immersed in a world that's both beautiful and unforgiving.
Right.
And as we've been discussing, it's a world that deserves our respect and protection.
Absolutely. Whether we're talking about high mountain tours, adventure races, or even just a casual hike in the foothills, it's about recognizing that we're part of this delicate ecosystem and that our actions, even seemingly small ones, can have a ripple effect.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of mountain sports, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with?
I think the mountains offer incredible opportunities for challenge, adventure, and personal growth, but they also demand a level of respect and responsibility. Whether you're a seasoned climber or just starting to explore those trails, remember that you're a guest in these wild spaces. Tread lightly, leave no trace, and perhaps even consider how you can give back to the places that bring you so much joy.
Beautifully said. And listener, if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, why not explore those local events and organizations working to promote sustainable outdoor recreation? Or maybe just spend some time reflecting on your own relationship with nature and how you can be a more responsible steward.
After all, the mountains will always be there waiting to challenge and inspire us.
Yeah.
It's up to us to ensure that they remain wild and beautiful for generations to come.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the heart of the mountains. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those hiking boots ready for adventure.